Ah, Baldric, do come in. Take a seat. Now, you wanted to see me about something?
Well, you see, it's about my pet video game.
Yes, go on.
Well, it seems to be getting a new DLC every month.
And how much weight does it gain?
About £7 per DLC.
Oh, that doesn't sound too healthy. Can I look at it?
Sure.
I'm sorry. Your game has a chronic case of paradoxia.
What? I thought it was an indie game though.
I believe this case is very similar to that of another title, Prison Architect.
A long time ago, in a land far away, there was an orphanage called Steam Indie Titles. It held many young games in its walls that frolicked around its long blue corridors. There was one thing that all these games wished for, and that was to be adopted by a huge multi-million corporation. There were many different kinds of games. There were the Goths, who all saw Amnesia and decided they wanted to be like her. There were the pixelated side-scrollers that realised 3D modelling was hard. And then there were those games which we will not talk about, due to YouTube. Now, in this orphanage, there were 3 things that could get you out of there. You could be bought by a corporation, you could grow up to become your very own company, or you could die a painful death.
Prison Architect was one of the exemplary games of the orphanage. He had a good concept, fun mechanics, and a nice art style.
Now, with such a perfect CV, Steam Indie Titles Incorporated had high hopes for this little game. Now, on one fateful day, Prince Paradox stepped out of his lair and decided that he would like to adopt a game. So Paradox came to the orphanage and decided to adopt Prison Architect. Now that the papers had been signed and the money paid, Prison Architect seemed to have a bright future ahead of him. But little did he know that on that day he caught a terrible illness. Now, when Prison Architect arrived at the Paradox lair, he found that most of the game seemed rather ill. Though it was unlike any illness Prison Architect had ever seen. They all were down with the DLCs. If you're wondering what DLC looks like, it's a bit like lumps, all full of extra content. Some of the inhabitants of this cave were covered head to toe in them. Crusader Kings 2, for example, had so many that you could hardly make out his facial features. Prison Architect settled into the lair and slept peacefully, still not knowing that he was infected too. In the morning, Prison Architect woke up to find out that on his arm there was something unusual. As his eyes adjusted to the light, he realised that he had not only 1, but 2 medium-sized lumps on his arm. His screams echoed throughout the lair, but sadly no one could hear him due to Paradox having invested in soundproof walls. Though, if you look closer at the lumps, you would realise what they were. In this DLC there was a book and fuck all else. It was a very common DLC, which is there to swindle imbeciles out of their money, or be thrown into a bundle for unsuspecting buyers. This DLC is called the copy and paste job, or what's already in the game but in book format. Or the professional name of art book. Unless you are part of the minority who bought the book to look at it, you most likely will only view it once and then forget about it. But this was far from the worst offender. In this DLC, there was something very different to the first lump. It seemed to have actual content. How gracious of Paradox to be so charitable. It seemed to be a soothsaying lump. These are very rare lumps indeed, as they can tell the future. This one shows you, the buyer, where you will end up after realising how little of this content there is. You get in this DLC some sofa walls, another 2 blobs called a warden, prisoners in white clothing, police officers in light blue clothing. Now give us £4. You may ask, is there any more content? More content? Who do you think we are? The disease had just become terminal. Although the lumps made him depressed, the other games consoled him. Crusader Kings told him that a mixed review is very normal for a Paradox DLC, and then pointed out the score on one of Stellaris' DLC, Infinite Frontiers, which was a book disguised as a DLC, and how he should think himself lucky that the same didn't happen to Aficionado. Months passed in the Paradox lair, with no sign of new lumps, and Prison Architect thought that maybe it had gone away. However, the DLC lumps had just begun. It was on the night of the 14th of May that it struck again. A great feat has happened in Paradox history. They didn't try to take your money for lackluster content. Surely this cannot be true, Paradox. Are you ill? In the future, great philosophers will talk of this conundrum for years to come, of how such a thing could even be possible. A free DLC from Paradox? Surely not. The future may seem bright for the DLC of Prison Architect, but the worst lumps lay right around the corner, about to come out. Again, time whisked by in the Paradox lair. As COVID pillaged the land, none of the games had to socially distance on the Paradox homepage due to them being considered a single household. And Prison Architect was left for a few months more. However, during the summer of 2020, another lump appeared. As this DLC came along during COVID, it decided to socially distance itself from all the other DLCs and be set on an island. However, on the boat ride there, it must have forgotten some of its luggage, as it arrived with hardly enough content for the asking price. But, with a heavy heart, it still decided to open its borders to the public. And much to the disappointment of the fans, they found that there was not much content to play with, and condemned it to a mixed review on Steam. All those evil fans actually wanting enough content for the asking price from the poor billion-dollar company. Winter came and went in the Paradox lair, but it did not matter, as the cold snap of capitalism was always felt in the cave. Months swept by where there were no lumps in sight, and Prison Architect believed that the DLCs would haunt him no longer. And he dreamed dreams of being free from the grasp of this unknown disease, known as DLC, that had covered the world of gaming in a thick darkness. But when he opened his eyes, he was still in the cave, covered in lumps, and awaiting the next one. There is a myth, long passed down from father to son, that states of a tree that grows the desires of all people. But yet we all believed it was a myth. Somehow this myth has come true with the DLC, the Farmer Lump. In this lump a tree grew, and when it came to the time of harvesting, its produce was pure money. And it was through this that a revelation came to Prison Architect. Finally, Prison Architect realized why he was getting these lumps. He was being infected on purpose. Paradox was in fact an evil capitalist scientist who was trying to please the higher ones in Wall Street. He suddenly felt very ill as he realized what becoming part of Paradox meant, and that now there was no escape from the lair. And what does this have to do with my pet video game? Well, nothing. Okay then, I'll go. Not just yet. You'll have to pay. So how much? Well, let's see. We spent 10 minutes talking, so that will be $125. What? That's ridiculous.